The morning sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the dry earth of Ayana's village. The sky, painted in soft pastels of pink and orange, seemed almost too beautiful for such a heartbreaking day. Inside her grandmother's hut, the light filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that danced silently in the air, silent like Ayana herself. She stood barefoot on the rough wooden floor, her toes stiff from the cold, her body draped in a white gown too large for her small frame. The gown, faded and slightly yellowed, had belonged to another girl, one who had likely smiled on her wedding day. But Ayana didn't smile. She couldn't. Her lips had forgotten how. She was only 15, yet her back was already bowed by the weight of adulthood. Her hands, trembling at her sides, had once held schoolbooks, wildflowers, her brother's fevered hand, but now, they hung empty, helpless. Her eyes, dry and vacant, stared ahead, not at the doorway, but through it, as if searching for a version of her life that might have been. Her veil scratched at her scalp, and the dress's lace collar chafed her neck, but she made no attempt to adjust them. Physical discomfort no longer registered, not when her heart was heavy with dread. Outside, the village stirred. People had gathered, not in celebration, but in uneasy silence. Women spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flitting toward the hut before quickly darting away. Men stood apart, shifting awkwardly, pretending to look elsewhere. No one offered comfort. No one met her gaze. They all knew. Everyone knew. Today, Ayana was to marry Mr. Elliot Langston, a white man from a distant land, 70 years old, a stranger with a wallet full of money and eyes that gleamed with something unreadable. Ayana didn't understand him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped, his voice low and flat. He barely knew her name, yet in mere moments, he would be called her husband. Her body stiffened at the thought, her stomach twisting with anxiety and confusion. She didn't hate him, not exactly. She didn't even know him well enough to feel hate. What she felt was fear. Not just of him, but of what this all meant, what it made her. What it would take from her. The memory of her brother, burning with fever, surged in her chest. That was why she had agreed. Not because she wanted to. Not because she understood what marriage meant. But because there was no one else left to save him. Her mother had tried everything, sold her sewing machine, her wedding ring, even Ayana's beloved books. But it hadn't been enough. And when Elliot had arrived, offering a sum that would pay for treatment, food, and shelter, there had been no more time to resist. No more choices to make. So Ayana had whispered, "I'll do it," as her mother cried beside her, and that was that. Now, as the drums began to beat, slow, rhythmic, final, Ayana took a shallow breath. Her legs moved forward as if pulled by invisible strings. She wasn't walking to a future. She was walking to a sentence, a decision carved out of desperation. And in her chest, beneath the borrowed silk and forced silence, a small voice whispered, "This is not the end. This cannot be the end." The ceremony was quiet, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Ayana stood at the center of it all, but it felt as if she were watching herself from somewhere far away. Her small hands trembled at her sides, hidden beneath layers of a white wedding gown that didn't belong to her. It had once been someone else's, perhaps worn in joy, perhaps in sorrow. Now, it clung to her like a costume in a cruel play. Her eyes, dry and distant, scanned the small gathering. No one met her gaze. Women whispered behind cupped hands, their faces lined with pity and guilt. The men avoided looking at her entirely, as though acknowledging her presence would make them complicit in the transaction that was unfolding before them. And maybe, deep down, they all knew it already was. Mr. Elliot Langston stood beside her, a figure so out of place in their sun-washed village he looked like a ghost. His suit was sleek, black, and expensive, an armor of wealth that contrasted violently with the dusty sandals and faded headscarves of the villagers. He was 6 times her age, a man with silver hair, tired eyes, and a strange stillness that made her skin crawl. When the elder asked if he took Ayana as his wife, he simply nodded once and said, "Yes." There was no emotion in his voice, no joy or passion, just a quiet finality, as if sealing a deal rather than beginning a life. Ayana said nothing. Her voice was buried too deep beneath the weight of fear and resignation. There was no kiss. No celebration. Just a thread of beads her grandmother tied gently around her neck, her fingers trembling with every knot. The old woman didn't cry, but Ayana could feel the ache in her silence. That night, the guest house was silent except for the ticking of an old clock in the hallway. Ayana sat on the edge of a bed too clean, too white, too foreign. She kept her hands tightly in her lap, too afraid to touch anything. Across the room, Elliot sat in an armchair, reading a thick book in a language she didn't understand. He said nothing for a long time, then stood, walked to her slowly, and handed her a warm bowl of soup. "You should eat," he said, his voice soft. It startled her. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since the wedding. She didn't reply. She stared at the bowl, her mind whirling with confusion. Why was he being kind? Why hadn't he tried to touch her? Her? That's what everyone had warned her about. That's what she had prepared herself to endure. But instead, he walked to the door of the adjoining room, stepped through it, and locked it, from his side. Alone again, Ayana curled up on the bed, soup untouched, her hands clutched tightly around the photo of her younger brother. She stared at it until her vision blurred, until the image became a smear of light and shadow. And for the first time since saying "I'll do it," she dared to ask herself the question that had haunted her from the start. What does he want from me, if not what everyone else did? The days that followed felt like a dream Ayana didn't know how to wake from. But it wasn't the nightmare she'd braced herself for, it was something stranger, something she couldn't quite name. She had prepared for pain, for fear, for the cold reality of being treated like property. She expected to be commanded, corrected, silenced. But Elliot did none of those things. Instead, he treated her with a quiet gentleness that only deepened her confusion. Every morning, there was a clean dress waiting for her, soft fabrics and calming colors, not the scratchy worn hand-me-downs she was used to. Her meals came on polished trays, with hot tea served precisely at 4 p.m., always with honey and a single linen-wrapped cookie. The guest house she'd expected to be her cage felt more like a carefully preserved sanctuary, though it still didn't feel like home. He gave her space. Too much space. It made her nervous. He never touched her, never raised his voice, never even looked at her the way men had before, hungrily, like she was something to be consumed. Instead, he watched her like she was something breakable, or sacred. She couldn't tell which. Ayana didn't trust it. Kindness, in her world, usually had strings attached. This was something else. But what? On the third night, unable to sleep, she tiptoed through the guest house and stopped outside the library door, which stood slightly ajar. A golden lamp glowed inside, casting soft light over Elliot's still figure. He was seated in his usual armchair, not reading this time, but staring into a tall mirror that hung above the fireplace. His face was pale, drawn with something she couldn't yet name, regret, perhaps, or grief. His lips moved faintly, whispering something too low for her to hear. Ayana watched from the shadows, frozen by the vulnerability of the scene. The man who had seemed so still, so composed, suddenly looked small. Human. Haunted. It unsettled her more than anything else he'd done. She stepped back, heart pounding, and hurried away without a sound. The next morning, she found a pair of boots and a scarf waiting for her by the door, alongside a worn leather notebook. "You should write," Elliot said gently as they walked together along a forest path behind the guest house. His breath clouded in the cool air, his steps slow and careful beside hers. "Why?" she asked, clutching the notebook close. "Because stories help make sense of things," he said after a pause. Then he looked at her with a strange sadness in his eyes. "And I think you'll need that, soon." The way he said it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He sounded like someone carrying a secret too heavy to hold for much longer. Ayana didn't know what he meant. But something inside her, something that had learned to listen carefully when adults spoke in half-truths and shadows, told her that her life was about to change again. And this time, she might not be able to run. By the fifth day, curiosity had taken root in Ayana's chest like a persistent weed, wrapping around her every thought. The hallway leading to the far end of the guest house seemed darker, quieter, as if it were hiding something. And at the very end stood a door, heavy, wooden, and always locked. A brass handle gleamed faintly in the dim light, untouchable, mysterious. She had asked Elliot about it once, casually, while they sat drinking tea on the veranda. He had simply smiled, that faint, unreadable smile of his, and said, "Some doors aren't ready to open yet." Then he changed the subject. But Ayanna couldn't let it go. She wasn't a child anymore. At least, she didn't feel like one. Poverty had aged her faster than years ever could. She had watched her brother burn with fever, seen her mother's hands tremble as she gave away the last of her belongings. And she had stood still while strangers whispered about her wedding to a man 6 times her age. So when Elliot left for town that evening, his usual slow steps echoing across the stone path, Ayanna stood in front of the locked door and pressed her ear to the wood. Nothing. Her fingers trembled as she knelt to examine the lock. It was old. Rust crept along its edges. She found a bent hairpin in the bathroom drawer and, heart pounding, began to pick the lock. It opened with a soft click. Inside, the room smelled of cedarwood and paper. At first glance, it looked like a study, dusty bookshelves, an old desk, a single dim lamp casting golden light. But then she saw the photographs. Dozens lined the walls, portraits of children from around the world. Some smiled brightly, others stared solemnly into the lens. Each photo was labeled with a name and a date. Some were marked with an X. Others were blank. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped farther in. In the corner, she spotted a wooden trunk, the lid slightly ajar. Inside were letters, faded notebooks, drawings, memories preserved in ink and paper. She pulled one out with shaking hands. "Dear Marisol, you're probably 17 now. I still think about your laughter. I hope you kept the violin. I'm sorry I had to leave so soon." Another, to Chica. "The stars were always brightest when you sang. I hope you found your mother. I hope you still sing." And then one, newer than the rest, the ink still dark and fresh, to Ayanna. "You don't know yet. But you will. I just hope I live long enough to see you smile for real." Ayanna froze. Her name. Her letter. Her heartbeat slammed in her chest like a drum. Why had he written her a goodbye letter before she even found it? She turned, instinctively, and nearly screamed. Elliot was standing in the doorway. He had returned early. He didn't look angry. Just tired. Worn down by years of secrets and sorrow. His eyes, usually so distant, now held something tender and infinite. "I suppose it's time you knew," he said softly. Ayanna clutched the letter to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "Knew what?" He stepped forward slowly, leaning against the doorframe, his silhouette framed by the golden light. "That I didn't marry you for me," he said. "I married you, for you." Ayanna stood there, trembling, the letter shaking in her hand, trying to understand the world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew was unraveling. This wasn't a transaction. It had never been about ownership. It had been something else entirely. And it scared her more than anything else ever had. That night, Ayanna couldn't sleep. She lay awake on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning in restless loops. The letter remained folded in her hand, as if parting from it would make the moment less real. She had read it again and again, trying to make sense of Elliot's words, trying to understand the man who had, in some quiet, inexplicable way, rewritten the rules of her world. What did he mean when he said he married her for her? Was that kindness? Pity? A rescue? Or something even more complicated than any word she knew? The silence of the house felt heavy now, not with menace, but with meaning. Every creak of the floorboard, every hush of the wind against the window felt like it carried a secret waiting to be named. And in the heart of that stillness, Ayanna began to recall all the small, almost invisible things Elliot had done, the fresh bread he left outside her room in the morning, the way he never once touched her without permission, how he looked at her not as a burden, but as someone he was simply waiting for. She thought of the room with all those letters and photographs. How many others had come before her? Children who had no one, girls with no choices, boys with no homes, and somehow, Elliot had carried their stories, one by one, across the years. Not as a savior. Not even as a father, exactly. But as someone who saw them. And now, Ayanna realized, he was seeing her too. Tears welled in her eyes, slow and unsure, like she wasn't quite ready to let them fall. She didn't know if she should be grateful or furious. She had come to this house expecting nothing. No future, no love. Only survival. But Elliot had offered her a door, one she didn't even know she was allowed to walk through. And that terrified her. Because what if it was real? What if this strange, quiet man wasn't just another grown-up making promises he couldn't keep? Suddenly, the weight of the years she had lived pressed hard on her chest. Every night she'd gone to bed hungry. Every time she'd swallowed her fear. Every moment she'd told herself not to hope. But now, sitting in that dimly lit room, holding a letter written just for her, Ayanna allowed herself, for the first time, to want more. She didn't know what more meant yet. She didn't even know if she trusted it. But it had been offered. And she could no longer pretend she didn't see it. She rose from the bed slowly, the wood floor cool beneath her feet, and walked to the window. Outside, the sky had cleared. 1,000 stars stretched across the night, quiet and watching. Ayanna placed the letter gently on the windowsill, her fingers lingering for a moment longer than they needed to. Then she whispered, not to anyone in particular, I don't know how to begin. But maybe. I want to. Behind her, the hallway remained dark and quiet. But within her, something had shifted. Not entirely healed, not completely sure, but open. And that was enough, for now. In the years that followed, Ayanna transformed from a silent girl into a global force. With Elliot's legacy in her own unshakable fire, she built schools, protected countless girls, and exposed the hidden networks behind child marriage. By 23, she was a voice at the United Nations. By 25, she led a movement that changed laws across nations. No longer a victim of her past, Ayanna became a symbol of hope, proof that even from the darkest beginnings, light can rise and lead the way.